They were told that America was starving. In the camps outside Dresden, in the barracks near Tokyo, in the cramped submarines beneath the Atlantic, they had been told that the enemy across the ocean was on the verge of collapse, that American children begged in the streets for scraps, that the mongrel nation of weaklings and degenerates could barely feed its own cities, let alone sustain an army across 2 oceans. The propaganda had been relentless, detailed, woven into every briefing and every broadcast. But in the spring of 1945, when Friedrich Hoffmann stepped through the doors of a Safeway supermarket in rural Virginia, flanked by 2 guards who seemed almost bored with their duty, his legs buckled beneath him. He gripped the shopping cart they had offered him, not to steady himself, but to confirm it was real, that this moment was actually happening, and the metal was cool and solid beneath his trembling fingers. The rows stretched before him like an accusation. Canned peaches glistened in pyramid displays, stacked 20 cans high and 40 wide, the golden fruit visible through the labels in perfect, impossible abundance. Bags of flour formed walls along the far aisle, 50-pound sacks piled as casually as sandbags, but these defended nothing and withheld nothing. They simply sat there, available, unguarded, priced at amounts that seemed incomprehensible. Friedrich had not seen butter in 2 years, not real butter, yet here were refrigerated cases running the length of the store's back wall, filled with golden blocks wrapped in waxed paper, dozens of brands he had never heard of competing for space. His throat tightened, his eyes burned. He had flown 63 combat missions over England and France. He had watched his wingman spiral into the channel in flames. He had not cried then, but standing before shelves of Campbell's soup, each red and white can identical to the next, marching in perfect rows that seemed to have no end, he felt something inside him crack. The other prisoners moved through the store in silence, their faces carefully blank, but their hands betrayed them. They touched everything. Werner Mueller ran his fingers along the mesh bags of oranges, 10 pounds for 49 cents, and his hand jerked back as if burned. Oranges. Real oranges, not the photographs in magazines, not the memories from childhood before the war, but actual fruit that he could hold and smell and theoretically purchase if he were not a prisoner wearing clothes stamped with the letters PW. Hans Dietrich stood before the meat counter for so long that one of the guards finally asked if he was feeling well. He could not answer. Behind the glass, arranged on crushed ice, lay steaks marbled with fat, whole chickens, pork chops thick as his fist, roasts that would feed his entire family for a week. The butcher, a heavy-set man with a blood-stained apron, looked up from his work and nodded at them, a casual acknowledgement, before returning to his cutting. Just another Tuesday morning. Just another display of protein that would have prevented the deaths of a dozen people Friedrich had known. They had been brought here deliberately, of course. The American officers had not explained the purpose of this excursion, had simply loaded 12 German POWs onto a truck at the camp outside Richmond and driven them into town. Some of the prisoners had assumed they were being transferred. Others worried about more sinister intentions, though the war in Europe had ended 3 weeks earlier, and the camps had grown almost relaxed, the guards less vigilant, the work details less demanding. No one had guessed this. No one could have prepared for this peculiar form of psychological warfare, because that was what it was. Friedrich understood with a clarity that felt like swallowing glass. This was a demonstration. This was a proof. This was the answer to every question they had never quite dared to ask during those long nights in the barracks, when the doubts crept in despite the training, despite the oaths, despite everything they had been taught to believe. The American military had established a policy, unofficial but widely practiced, of exposing Axis prisoners to everyday American abundance. The logic was both practical and philosophical. Practical, because they hoped these men would return to their devastated homelands and speak of what they had seen, perhaps dampening any future appetite for war. Philosophical, because the Americans believed deeply, perhaps naively, in the power of their way of life to speak for itself, to make their case more effectively than any propaganda ever could. So they took prisoners to supermarkets, to department stores, to farms where single families operated machinery that would have required a village in Europe. They showed them America's bounty not as an act of mercy but as an act of persuasion. Friedrich moved down the cereal aisle, and his mind could not reconcile what his eyes reported. Cornflakes, Rice Krispies, Wheaties, Cheerios, shredded wheat, grape nuts, puffed rice, puffed wheat, a dozen others whose names he could barely pronounce. Each brand in multiple sizes. Each box decorated with bright colors and cartoon characters and promises of nutritional superiority. In Germany, his mother had ground oats by hand when she could get them. His sister had learned to make bread from sawdust and potato peels. And these boxes, there must have been 200 boxes on these shelves, represented choices. The American housewife, he realized, did not simply buy cereal. She selected from an array of cereals, weighing preferences and prices, exercising judgment in a marketplace that presumed her discernment mattered. The propaganda had prepared them for many things. They had been taught that Americans were soft, made weak by comfort and racial mixing. They had been told that democracy was chaos, that freedom was merely another word for disorder, that a strong nation required strong leadership and unified purpose. They had seen photographs of breadlines from the Depression, read accounts of American strikes and labor unrest, been assured that the capitalist system was eating itself from within. The Führer himself had spoken of America's inevitable collapse, had mocked Roosevelt's promises, had declared that a nation of shopkeepers and immigrants could never match the will of the German people. Standing in this supermarket in Virginia, breathing in the mingled scents of fresh bread and floor wax and the faint sweetness of ripening bananas, Friedrich felt the entire architecture of his worldview beginning to tilt. Hans found him near the dairy case, where milk sat in glass bottles, 3 deep on shelves that ran 10 feet in each direction. Neither man spoke for a long moment. Finally, Hans said quietly, his voice barely audible above the store's piped-in music, "I have been thinking about the fuel." Friedrich nodded, understanding immediately. The trucks that brought these goods to this store, the refrigeration that kept the milk cold, the electricity that powered the lights blazing overhead in brilliant fluorescent abundance, the infrastructure that connected farms to factories to warehouses to this single small supermarket in a town whose name Friedrich could not remember. The fuel alone, the gasoline and diesel and coal and oil required to maintain this system, to keep it running not just in Virginia but presumably in every town across this vast country. Germany had strangled itself chasing oil fields in the Caucasus, had squeezed synthetic fuel from coal at enormous cost, had rationed every drop with fanatical precision. And here, the wheels of commerce turned so freely that milk traveled hundreds of miles to sit in illuminated abundance, available to anyone with pocket change. Werner had discovered the candy aisle, and something in his expression frightened Friedrich more than the earlier shock. Werner was smiling, but his eyes were wet, and he held a Hershey bar in each hand, turning them over and over, reading the wrapper as if it contained a secret message. 5 cents, he whispered. Friedrich, 5 cents. They both knew what he meant. 5 cents was nothing, was less than nothing, was an amount so trivial that Americans probably lost it between couch cushions and never bothered to look. The chocolate itself was unremarkable, mass-produced, probably inferior to the Swiss chocolate they had tasted before the war. But the fact that it existed, that it was so abundant and so cheap that children could buy it with their allowance, that cocoa had somehow made its way from wherever cocoa grew to this Virginia town in such quantities that it was stacked in casual pyramids, available to anyone who wanted it. Werner's smile cracked, and he set the chocolate bars down very carefully, as if they might explode. The other shoppers, actual American civilians going about their actual Tuesday errands, largely ignored the prisoners and their guards. A woman in a floral dress consulted her shopping list and selected canned tomatoes without glancing their way. An elderly man compared prices on coffee, muttering to himself about highway robbery at 38 cents a pound. A mother negotiated with her young son about cookies, agreeing to one package if he behaved himself while she finished shopping. This casual normalcy was perhaps more devastating than the abundance itself. These people were not celebrating a special occasion, not hoarding in anticipation of shortages, not grateful for unexpected fortune. They were simply shopping, engaging in a routine so mundane that the child was bored, that the old man felt entitled to complain about prices, that the woman's mind was clearly elsewhere, planning dinner or thinking about other errands. Friedrich had been educated in his doubts slowly, over the months of his captivity. The food in the POW camp had been adequate, sometimes generous, which had surprised him. The guards had been largely professional, occasionally even friendly, which had confused him. The Red Cross packages had arrived regularly, which seemed impossible for a nation supposedly on the brink of starvation. But he had rationalized these observations, had told himself that the camp was perhaps exceptional, that the Americans were putting on a show for the international observers, that somewhere beyond the wire the real America struggled and suffered as they had been promised. The supermarket destroyed these rationalizations. This was not a show. No one was performing for their benefit. This was simply reality, the daily truth of American life, and it rendered everything he had believed into ash. In the camp, late at night, the prisoners talked. Not everyone, not openly, but in careful whispers between trusted friends. They talked about the bomber formations they had seen, so vast they darkened the sky, and where all those aircraft had come from if America was weak. They talked about the equipment they had faced, the Sherman tanks rolling off assembly lines in such numbers that losses did not matter, the artillery pieces, the trucks, the weapons that seemed endless. They talked about the American soldiers, who had not seemed like weaklings or degenerates but like farmers and shopkeepers and factory workers who had learned to fight competently, if not brilliantly, sustained by a supply chain that never faltered. The propaganda had called them mongrels, but mongrels, Friedrich now thought, might possess a hybrid vigor that purebreds lacked. The guards gave them 30 minutes in the store, though it felt like hours and also like seconds. Time had become elastic, stretched by the weight of revelation. Friedrich forced himself to walk every aisle, to bear witness to each section, to compile a mental inventory that he knew he would need later, though for what purpose he could not yet say. The canned goods aisle alone would have provisioned a company for weeks. The produce section offered fresh vegetables in December, somehow transported from warmer climates, arrayed in tidy bins with hand-lettered signs advertising the prices. The bakery filled an entire corner of the store, bread and rolls and pastries emerging from ovens in the back, the yeast and sugar scent drifting across the other aisles like an indictment. He paused at the magazine rack near the checkout counters, where Life and Look and the Saturday Evening Post displayed covers showing healthy families, new automobiles, modern kitchens. The propaganda had shown them some of these images, but presented them as lies, as fabrications designed to mask American desperation. Friedrich had believed that interpretation because it had made sense, because the alternative was too troubling to consider. But standing here, having walked through this temple of abundance, the images looked less like propaganda and more like documentation. These magazines were not being distributed to impress prisoners of war. They were being sold to ordinary Americans for 10 cents, purchased casually and read and probably thrown away, because there would always be more next week. One of the guards, a corporal from Ohio named Jenkins, had been watching him. "You want to see something?" Jenkins asked, his tone not unkind. He led Friedrich to the front window, where a parking lot spread before them. "Count the cars," Jenkins said. Friedrich counted. 18 automobiles, most of them relatively new, parked haphazardly while their owners shopped inside. "This is a small town," Jenkins continued. "About 5,000 people, probably 200 cars total, maybe more. My dad's a machinist. He owns a car. My uncle's a plumber. He owns a car. My sister's a secretary. She's saving to buy a car." He let that sink in for a moment. "Your bosses told you we were weak. But a nation where secretaries can save for automobiles, where that abundance is so normal nobody even thinks about it, that's not weakness. That's something else entirely." Friedrich wanted to argue. wanted to find some flaw in the logic, wanted to defend the ideology he had sworn to uphold. But the words would not come, because the words would have been lies, and he had seen enough of lies. He had lived inside a lie for years, had breathed it and eaten it and fought for it, and the truth was here in this supermarket in Virginia, in the casual plenty that required no explanation and made no apologies. The American system, whatever its flaws and contradictions, had generated this bounty. The German system, for all its rhetoric about strength and purity and destiny, had led to rubble and starvation and defeat. The mathematics were simple, even brutal in their clarity. They were loaded back onto the truck in the same silence they had maintained in the store. No one spoke during the drive back to camp. What was there to say? The guards did not gloat or lecture. They simply returned to their posts, their duty fulfilled, their point made more effectively than any speech could have accomplished. Friedrich climbed down from the truck and walked across the compound to his barracks, his mind churning through implications and memories and the sudden, vertiginous feeling of the ground falling away beneath him. That night, he tried to write a letter to his mother. The censors would read it before it was sent, if it was sent at all, so he had to be careful with his words. But he needed to tell someone, needed to process what he had witnessed by putting it into language. "I saw today a store," he wrote, then paused. How to describe it? How to convey the reality without sounding insane, without having his family dismiss his words as the delusions of a broken man. They have things here that we cannot imagine. Food in amounts that seem impossible. I do not think they are suffering as we were told. I do not think they were ever suffering. Mama, I believe we may have been deceived about many things. He scratched out the last sentence. Too dangerous, too explicit. The censors might not allow it. His mother might not forgive it. But once thought, the idea could not be unthought. Deception required deceivers. The propaganda had come from somewhere, from specific people making specific decisions to tell specific lies. And millions had believed, Friedrich included, because they had wanted to believe, because the alternative required accepting that their sacrifices had been in vain, that the cause had been not just lost but wrong from the beginning. In the adjacent bunk, Werner lay staring at the ceiling. "I keep thinking about the bread," he said quietly. "The smell of it, fresh from the oven. When did you last smell fresh bread, Friedrich?" Not since France, Friedrich thought, in a bakery in a town whose name he had forgotten, looted by his unit during the advance. Years ago, a lifetime ago. "They make it every day here," Werner continued. "Every single day. More bread than they can eat, and tomorrow they will make more. What kind of country does that? What kind of system produces so much that waste is built into the equation?" The question hung in the darkness between them. Friedrich had no answer, or rather, he had an answer he did not want to speak aloud. A successful system, he thought. A system that worked, that generated wealth, and distributed it widely enough that even working-class families ate fresh bread and owned automobiles and chose between a dozen types of cereal. Not a perfect system, certainly. He had seen poverty in America too, had worked alongside black prisoners who spoke of segregation and injustice, had heard stories of strikes and unemployment and social unrest. But imperfect and dysfunctional were not the same thing. The American system, for all its contradictions, produced results. The German system, for all its pageantry and promises, had produced catastrophe. Over the following weeks, the supermarket visit became a reference point in the barracks, a shared trauma that did not diminish with time but instead grew in significance. Men who had not been on that particular excursion did not quite believe the descriptions, thought perhaps the details were exaggerated, the trauma overstated. Then they would take their own trips to other stores in other towns and return with the same haunted expressions, the same inability to quite articulate what they had experienced. It was not the food itself that broke them, but what the food represented. It was not the abundance, but the implications of that abundance. It was not even the proof that they had been lied to, but the deeper, more troubling realization that they had needed those lies, had clung to them, had built their identities around them. Some men reacted with anger, directing their rage at the officers who had fed them propaganda. at the politicians who had led them into disaster, at the system that had demanded everything and delivered nothing but ruin. Others retreated into denial, insisting that what they had seen was exceptional, that most Americans surely still suffered, that the stores were staged or temporary or somehow misleading. But Friedrich found himself moving towards something else, something that felt like grief, but deeper, more comprehensive. He mourned for the years he had lost to ideology, for the friends who had died believing lies, for the cities bombed and the civilians killed in service of a cause that had been bankrupt from the beginning. He mourned for Germany itself, for what it had been and what it had become, and for the long, difficult road that surely lay ahead. The camp administrators began showing films on Friday nights, projected against the wall of the mess hall. Newsreels, propaganda in their own way, but propaganda of a different sort. American factories churning out tanks and aircraft at rates that seemed physically impossible. American shipyards launching Liberty ships faster than the U-boats could sink them. American farms harvesting wheat that stretched to the horizon. Acres and acres worked by machines that required only a handful of operators. The footage was meant to demoralize, to break any remaining will to resist. But by the time Friedrich saw these films, he was already broken, already reconstituted into something different than what he had been. One film showed the Willow Run plant in Michigan, where Ford built B-24 bombers on an assembly line, one aircraft every hour. Friedrich had flown against those bombers, had seen them fill the sky in formations of hundreds, had wondered in an abstract way where they all came from. Now he knew. They came from factories organized with the same efficiency that stocked supermarkets with cereal, from a society that had mastered mass production and scaled it to levels that overwhelmed all opposition. The German factories had been bombed into rubble, yes, but even at full capacity they had never approached this kind of output. The war had not been won by superior courage or superior technology or superior will. It had been won by superior logistics, superior resources, superior systems. It had been won, in a sense, by supermarkets. After the films, the prisoners were allowed to purchase items from the camp canteen. The prices were subsidized, the selection limited, but the principle was the same as the supermarket: choice, commerce, the exercise of preference in a market economy. Friedrich bought chocolate and cigarettes, using scrip he had earned from work details, and the transaction felt like a small rehearsal for whatever came next, for the world he would eventually rejoin. That world would be difficult, he knew. Germany was destroyed, occupied, divided. Food was scarce, fuel scarcer, hope perhaps scarcest of all, but he would return with knowledge that might prove more valuable than any material resource. He would return knowing that the American model, whatever its flaws, had demonstrated its effectiveness in the most brutal test imaginable. He would return knowing that ideology could not substitute for productivity, that propaganda could not replace bread, that will alone could not triumph over industrial capacity. In late summer, the Red Cross arranged for letters from home to reach the prisoners more regularly. Friedrich received one from his sister, the first communication in 8 months. She wrote of conditions in Berlin, of rationing so severe that people ate grass, of buildings reduced to rubble, of women assaulted by occupying soldiers, of a city and a nation broken beyond anything she could have imagined. "We were told we were winning until the very end," she wrote. "Even when the Russians were in our streets, the radio said victory was near. What happened, Friedrich? Where did it all go wrong?" He read the letter 3 times, each reading revealing new dimensions of pain. His sister, 5 years younger, had believed in the cause with a fervor that had troubled even him. She had served in the League of German Girls, had worked in munitions factories, had sung the songs and believed the promises. Now she was picking through rubble, eating grass, wondering what had happened. He wanted to write back. "It went wrong from the beginning. We were lied to about everything, but especially about our enemies and our chances and ourselves." But such a letter would never reach her, and even if it did, she might not be ready to hear it. Instead, he wrote about the weather in Virginia, about the work details he had been assigned, about the food in the camp and the treatment by the guards. Bland details, careful neutrality. But at the end, he added, "When I return, we will need to rebuild everything. Not just the buildings, Helga, but how we think about the world. I have learned things here that are difficult to explain in a letter. But I believe we were wrong about many things, and we must have the courage to admit that and begin again." It was vague enough to pass the censors, but specific enough, he hoped, that his sister would understand he had changed in some fundamental way. Autumn came to Virginia with a gentleness that seemed obscene given the devastation elsewhere. The leaves turned colors that Friedrich had not seen in years, reds and golds that reminded him of peacetime, of childhood, of a world before the madness. The camp administrators organized a harvest festival, allowing prisoners to work alongside local farmers to bring in crops. Friedrich found himself in an orchard, picking apples, and the absurdity of it struck him with unexpected force. German prisoners harvesting American apples to feed American civilians, contributing to the abundance that had so devastated his worldview. But the work was satisfying in a way that combat had never been, productive rather than destructive, adding to the world rather than subtracting from it. The farmer who owned the orchard, an old man named Peterson whose sons had both served in Europe, brought lunch to the workers at midday. Sandwiches thick with ham and cheese, apples from the morning's harvest, fresh milk in glass bottles. He distributed the food without ceremony, prisoners and guards eating together in the shade of the trees. Peterson sat on a stump and watched them eat, his expression unreadable. Finally, he said, "My boys are coming home next month." Both of them made it through. Thank God. They fought against your people. And I suppose you fought against them. Strange world, isn't it? Yesterday enemies, today picking my apples together. Friedrich swallowed his bite of sandwich, tasting the ham and butter and fresh bread, aware that he held in his hands a meal worth more than he could have imagined a year ago. "Yes, sir," he said carefully. "Very strange." Peterson nodded and said nothing more, but the moment lingered, heavy with implications. The war was over. The old hatreds would persist for some, but practical realities demanded accommodation, demanded that yesterday's enemies find ways to exist in the same world, perhaps even to work side by side in apple orchards on autumn afternoons. It was not the supermarket alone that transformed Friedrich's understanding, but the supermarket had been the catalyst, the moment when the cognitive dissonance became too great to ignore. Everything that followed, all the small observations and quiet revelations, built upon that foundation of cracked certainty. He began to see the war not as a tragic necessity but as a catastrophic error, not as a noble struggle but as a waste of lives and resources in service of a lie. This understanding did not make him feel liberated. It made him feel complicit, guilty, ashamed of his own gullibility and the years he had spent in service to madness. Some prisoners never accepted the evidence before them, clung to the old beliefs with desperate intensity, insisted until the day they were repatriated that Germany had been righteous and betrayed, and somehow still superior despite the comprehensive defeat. Friedrich understood the impulse. Accepting the truth meant accepting that they had been fools, that their friends had died for nothing, that their cause had been not just lost but corrupt from inception. That was a heavy burden to carry, heavier perhaps than the burden of continuing to believe comfortable lies. But Friedrich found he could not unknow what he now knew. The supermarket had done its work too thoroughly. In December, as the first anniversary of the Battle of the Bulge approached, the guards organized a Christmas celebration in the camp. There was no strategic reason for this generosity, no propaganda value. The war had been over for months, the prisoners well-behaved and docile, the world moving on to new crises. But the Americans seemed to believe in Christmas as more than a holiday, as an obligation to demonstrate their values even to enemies, perhaps especially to enemies. They erected a tree in the mess hall, served special meals, distributed small gifts purchased with camp funds. Friedrich received soap, socks, and chocolate, modest items that nonetheless represented a kind of care he had not expected. On Christmas Eve, a local church group came to the camp and sang carols outside the wire. German carols, sung in German by Americans of German descent, their voices carrying across the cold air. Still a knock, especially broke something in the assembled prisoners, hundreds of men who had not cried for years now weeping openly as the familiar words washed over them. Friedrich thought of his mother, his sister, everyone he had left behind in the ruins of Berlin, and wondered if they were singing tonight, if they had any reason to sing, if hope persisted in the rubble and the hunger and the cold. He thought of the supermarket, of the abundance that could exist in the same world as such devastation, and the unfairness of it threatened to overwhelm him. But unfairness was the wrong lens, he realized. The destruction in Germany was not random misfortune. It was consequence, the result of choices made and policies pursued, and a war started with criminal arrogance. The abundance in America was not unearned luck. It was the product of systems and values and decisions that, whatever their flaws, had proven more sustainable and more productive than the alternatives. Fairness had nothing to do with it. Cause and effect, action and consequence. These were the forces that had shaped the world he now inhabited. Germany had sown the wind and reaped the whirlwind. America had planted different seeds and harvested supermarkets. The repatriations began in early 1946, though Friedrich was not in the first groups. The seriously wounded went first, then the older prisoners, then those with special circumstances. Friedrich was young and healthy, and had no one depending on him at home, so he waited. The waiting was its own kind of torment, suspended between the world he had known and the world he would face, between the person he had been and the